which at this point is scheduled for March the 9th as a special city council meeting. We'd like to meet at 4:30 at the Big M building because it doesn't have electricity, and so we're going to need as much daylight as we can to get through that particular building. We will continue on with the building tour at the Wells Fargo building at 6 o'clock later that evening. So you want to bring snacks. You'll also want to bring flashlights. You want to dress warmly. One of the buildings is not heated, essentially, or poorly heated. There's no ADA access at the Big M building right now because the elevators are broken. So you'll have to hike the stairs up and down. So if you're not feeling up to the 8 or so floor hike up and down, that'll be something you'll want to be attentive to. And as I mentioned, we'll start that at 4:30 in the lobby of the Big M building. After you go through the buildings with the architects, you'll have an opportunity to sort of ask them questions about the reports and also what you've seen. That's the whole idea of getting you the reports out first, so that way you can identify, or before you go, any areas that you have a concern or you want to see firsthand, and then use that report as your guide to essentially going through the building. So that's the hope, at least going through. After that happens, then we do plan to bring back to you for your consideration the finalized architectural report and the city staff's recommendation, along with the technical team's recommendation for the City Hall relocation project, and we expect that to occur on March 16th. Next up, we'll talk a little bit about the gathering space. We have moved on to Site 3, as you know. We have been informed that we do have a very willing seller on Site 3. The environmental review process has already been underway, and we imagine that to conclude essentially officially sometime this month. We are expecting the release of funds shortly thereafter, and so it looks like you'll have, at least as an option, Site 3 to consider as the gathering space moving forward. I understand that this is one of the projects that you'll likely want to discuss at the special city council meeting on February 24th. And so we will not do anything other than carry out the work that's already been directed of us and not start anything new until we get confirmation at this February 24th meeting that this project is still as anticipated in moving forward. So that's what I have for you on the gathering space. As I've already mentioned a few times, maybe just throw it out there one more time, the NDR program, National Disaster Resiliency Program, and all of the projects will be up for discussion at the special city council meeting on February 24th. That meeting will happen in this room, council chambers, at 5:30 p.m. Go as long as you'd like it to go. We will have a conversation about whatever you want as it relates to the NDR program. If it means moving money or reprioritizing or any of those sorts of things, substantial amendments, technical amendments, whatever it is that you're interested in discussing, we can do that at that special city council meeting. So for the public, this would be a great opportunity for them to come as well. I don't know if you intend to take testimony or not. Certainly something you can decide later. But we do want to make sure everyone's aware, because we stepped into the National Disaster Resiliency Program with an enormous amount of community input and involvement. It makes sense to continue that in this conversation as well. Moving forward, let's talk a little bit about the census. As you know, this is a new decade, and with the new decade comes a new census count, or at least an official count. This is very, very important to the city of Minot because we are right on the cusp of reaching the 50,000 person population number. And of course, if we reach that 50,000 person number, then we will become an entitlement city, and that means we will be eligible for potentially anywhere between $350,000 to maybe upwards of $500,000 of annual community development block grant funds that we will not have to compete for if the program still remains as it is today. So that's important, and that's why it is so important that we count every single person in our community. And of course, to be counted, all you have to do is live here for 6 months and 1 day. So that means students, it means military, it means anybody can be counted if they live here for 6 months and 1 day. The committee has been fast at work. I want to thank Alderman Olson for her leadership, as well as our Community Development Director, Brian Billingsley, and a whole host of other community leaders for advancing this important work. They've adopted a new slogan, more means more. And just for the reasons I said, the more people we have, the more money we earn. The census actual day, the counting day, is officially April 1st, but the activities that will be occurring between now and April 1st, and even after April 1st, are going to be varied, and they're going to be many. So this team is one of a very small number of community count or census community count teams that are out there in the state of North Dakota, and their work is extremely important. So we're excited for what this is going to mean for us. You'll start seeing a lot of advertising and marketing that will take place. We were very successful in getting multiple grants from the state and pass-throughs through the federal government for the advertising and marketing. You'll see a couple of our sanitation trucks get wrapped with awareness campaigns and so on and so forth. A number of different things, flyers and media and those sorts of things will all be out there. So we'll start to get everybody excited about this. Next, I wanted to just update you on a conversation I had with the Interim Taxation Committee down at the State House last week. I was asked to go as one of 4 or 5 cities to report on their special assessment revenue replacement study. You might recall that during the legislative session this year, House Bill 1474 was a revenue replacement, actually it was a revenue addition that was added called a utility tax, essentially another way to collect revenues that would allow cities to maybe not use or not use as much special assessments for the collection of costs or revenues associated with development and other sorts of infrastructure. That was changed went through a few iterations through the legislative process, and eventually through that process it kind of worked itself into a replacement fee, if you will, or tax, and then eventually it got sort of remanded to a study. So the committee had asked for various cities to come and sort of speak on the issue and sort of tell them what we thought about it. And so I just thought I'd share you a couple brief highlights. You know, special assessments for us are important, but they're not nearly as important as a revenue stream for many other communities around North Dakota. In fact, our special assessment revenue as a proportion of our fiscal year 2020 budget only accounts for just over half of 1% of our total revenue. It's remarkably small. In fact, that was only about $1.7 to $1.8 million of our total budget for last year. We only have currently about less than 2,000 properties, or 10% of all properties in the city, that have some sort of special assessment that's tied to them. And our average special assessment is less than $600. That's average across the city. This is for a number of reasons. One, we don't have a lot of special assessments. And for two, we provide 50% generally of the cost in municipal funds toward the special assessment, which means we only assess essentially half the total cost. The other reason we don't have a lot of high special assessments is because we have a policy where growth pays for growth. That means if you're a new developer and you want to build infrastructure and build a new community, say a residential subdivision or apartments or whatnot, more than not, I think almost 98% of the time, we are requiring those developers to install that infrastructure at their cost and tie that cost directly to the sale of the house, the rental of the apartment, or whatever it is. So we don't have a lot of special assessments like other communities do for that reason. When it came to our thoughts about House Bill 1474, I made it very clear that we are not looking for any kind of bill that would eliminate the use of special assessments. Even though we don't use them very much, they are important tools, and we don't want to lose that tool in our toolbox. We also want to preserve local control, and so I made that clear to the Taxation Committee that preserving local control and allowing flexibility for the collection of revenues is really important to us, and that we wanted to preserve that. And then also, we didn't want, well, we were open to a variety of different funding alternatives as long as it didn't take any of those alternatives off the table for us today. In the end, the Taxation Committee essentially killed House Bill 1474, and so any work on this in the form of a utility tax will have to come back through the regular legislative process. So essentially, it's as if it never happened. That was the results of the committee. Which is fine with us, essentially. I think for Bismarck and maybe a couple other communities, there might be some more disappointment there. But we are open, like I say, to other funding considerations. Let's move to the parking structures just really quick. We have a number of updates to provide for you on the parking ramps. The cleaning and repair of the parking ramps is essentially done. We're excited about that. We have replaced lighting. We've cleaned a number of different things inside the parking ramps. The roofing is on both structures, so that's complete. We're excited by that. We did notice, however, while we were putting the roofs on, that the central structure did have damage to the EIFS. or the exterior finish insulation system. And so we are having to go back and repair that. And that was due to the fact that these buildings have been without a roof. They've been exposed since they were constructed. So that's damage that we've also added to our claim, which I'll talk about here in just a moment. Up next for the parking ramps, we're installing quite a few cameras inside and around the periphery, I should say, of the parking ramps, and that will definitely boost security and hopefully add to a more safe environment. The other thing we're going to be working on is we're trying to figure out how to keep these pigeons out of there. These pigeons are creating a problem for us, of course, on the cleanliness and sort of just annoyance standpoint. So staff are working to try to figure that particular problem out as well. As it relates to the parking structures, as you know, we began litigation on those structures back in March of 2018. I thought it was probably due to give you an update on where we stand on this. The attorneys are working through our discovery phase of the process. As you know, there's quite a bit of work to do on that front. We were successful in keeping the venue in Ward County. That was one of the activities that we had to go through, which was good for us. And as well, we are working through the 12,000 documents that have so far been discovered. We've whittled those down, and attorneys are working through that. We're finalizing the deposition dates between now and the next couple of months, and we'll be scheduling those that need to be deposed. And essentially right now, it looks like the suit's likely going to be scheduled for September of 2020. It has been bumped a few times, so I can't tell you with confidence if that's really where it's going to be. But there is certainly an enormous amount of work. We're having to reach out to a number of different folks that worked for the city in the past and no longer work for us, different contractors, different experts, and all of that sort of stuff. So it's quite the undertaking. I can tell you that everybody's been very cooperative, and I'm grateful for that. So more to come on this, but it is a slow process, as the legal system tends to sort of be that way. Next up, we'll talk about the Free Dump Week results. I won't spend much time on this other than to say we've had a record year this last year. Of course, we have Free Dump Week is essentially run through about December 23rd through January 4th. These are great numbers. If you're looking at an outreach, from an outreach perspective, they're really not great numbers if you're looking at the amount of waste that we, as a community, send to the landfill. We essentially had a 40% increase in tickets at the scales, meaning people going through the gates. And as far as tons of use, we had a 47% increase in total tonnage between 2018 and 2019. That is a lot of waste that's going through the landfill. And so, we would like to just remind folks, the best way to reduce waste is to not essentially get waste, right? Try to avoid that. Our next event, because it is a popular event, the next Free Dump Week will be with the spring cleanup, and that'll occur in early May. And of course, we'll announce those dates as we get closer to them. The Citizens Academy is being scheduled now. It'll take place between May 5th and the 26th. It'll be Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. There'll be several sessions. Each of these sessions will cover different aspects of the police department, including patrol, crime scene response, special operations, use of force, and a whole other myriad of topics. This will be fun. This is, I think, our second or third year in a row of having this after about a 10-year or so hiatus. If folks are interested, the applications are due by April the 18th. And of course, I've got Master Police Officer Aaron Moss's information here in the top right-hand corner, his phone number and his email, because that's the officer you want to talk with in order to register. You have to be 18 or older, and you do have to consent to a background check, because we are taking you kind of behind the scenes. You can get to do all kinds of fun and great stuff. We want to make sure that that's safe for everybody who's attending. So that's a don't miss kind of situation as well. So, and I think several of you have gone through this in the past and have found it to be very educational and fun, for that matter. So we encourage everyone who has an interest to do that. We have a local hero in the house to recognize. Essentially, the Minotauros have started a local Superheroes Award campaign. And through this effort, they identify through social media a variety of different local superheroes that should be nominated and then eventually voted on. And our own Master Police Officer, Aaron Moss, was recognized as the Minotauros Local Superhero Award. I think Aaron's in the audience. There he is. Stand up, be recognized. There he is. Yeah. Yeah. Another fine staff member making us look good in the city. We love that kind of stuff. In any event, we're very grateful for the Minotauros recognizing one of our own, and we're very grateful for all that Master Police Officer Aaron Moss does for our community. He is an outstanding local superhero. Up next, we have a sort of bitter farewell here. And I appreciate the mayor joining me. We're going to talk just a little bit here and give a formal goodbye to two folks from the police department. And so I think, Barb, where are you? I thought I saw you here earlier. Barb, you want to come on up? And then Chief Olson, maybe we'll do Barb first, and then we'll have the chief come up here in just a minute. Barb, we kind of said a lot to you. Yeah, I sort of feel like I should turn around here. Is that all right? So we had a good time with you guys at the sort of informal retirement party on Friday. So, but I know it was important to the mayor especially, and to me as well, in front of the community and on television, for that matter, to recognize you for an outstanding career with the police department. We are so grateful for all that you've done for us, and you leave a tremendous legacy and a wonderfully well-run PSAP department. We're just so grateful. I know the mayor has something you'd like to say and share with you as well.
Absolutely. So we have a lot of folks with the men and women in blue here with the protective shields that know Barb very well, but many in our community likely don't. Barb, more than 30 years, 31 years now, is it? Is that correct? 32 years, Central Dispatch for the Minot Police Department. And as I explained during the retirement ceremony, these are the calming voices at the other end when 911 is called. And the amount of years that have been dedicated to the citizens of Minot being that calming voice and being dedicated to the career with the sacrifices at home. As she explained, there was a lot of rotating shifts early on and very, not the most family-friendly working shifts that a person could have. But of course, the McPeak family sacrificed, and Barb spent a lot of time serving the folks of Minot, and to likely many that she never met, but was fortunate to be at the other end working with all of our great men and women in uniform, making sure that the citizens of Minot are safe. So Barb, I did hold out the city coin, the office of mayor coin, for you tonight as a thank you for your 32 years of service to the citizens of Minot. Thank you, Barb.
Well, thank you, Mayor. I wanted to just also do the same for Chief Olson as he retires from the city. I just want to read a few statistics about Chief Olson, and then I know you have something for him as well. Jason Olson began his career with the city of Minot, and it's been debated, but I think we've settled on May 9th, right? 1988 as a police officer. He was promoted to senior officer May 10th, 1992, and then again to sergeant on March 3rd, 1997. But he was also promoted to lieutenant on March 20th, 2004, then to captain on March 22nd, 2010, and then finally to chief on April 14th, 2012, where he faithfully served in that office until last Friday. Jason's career included experience in all aspects of policing inside the department and included 18 years with the SWAT team, with 6 of those years being the SWAT commander. He was named the 2004 Police Officer of the Year by the Optimist Club. Jason's leadership and skills have long been recognized both inside and outside of his department, earning him the reputation of being not only hardworking, but also fair, honest, and extremely well respected. The City of Minot would like to thank and recognize Jason Olson for his loyal years of dedicated service to the city and to the police force. We are so grateful for your legacy. We are grateful so much for what you leave behind and for the shape that you leave our city and our department and our community in. Thank you so much for all of your years of service, Jason.
Now at the retirement ceremony, we stood up and said quite a few words on Friday, but I don't know if a plaque ever goes far enough for the amount of sacrifice that goes into the work that a police officer and their family certainly goes through the entire career, the amount of hours that have been put forth. But I think it's certainly more than worthy today to present you with this in the name of the people of the city of Minot. This certificate of appreciation is presented to Jason Olson, Police Chief, May 9th, 1988 to January 31st, 2020, in grateful recognition of outstanding public service faithfully rendered to the city of Minot. Jason, we are saying goodbye to a great chief, but I know that your leadership and the leadership that you were brought up through has left the city of Minot in great hands and has a reputation that I think many across the country could only hope to have with our men and women who wear the shields of protection for our communities. Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
And two, I wanted to make sure that before you go, that off of the Office of Mayor for the city of Minot, one more coin to add to your collection, Chief. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. If you wouldn't mind staying up here, also Mr. Mayor as well. We have an important event as well tonight, not only saying goodbye to an outstanding chief and a wonderful community leader, but welcoming another into our ranks. Captain Klug, now our police chief, Chief Klug. I'll have to get used to that. He has been a long-standing member of our community, having lived in Minot for more than 20 years. Would you come on up and join me, Chief? He was a graduate of the Peace Officers Training Course in Northwestern University's Police Staff and Command Program. And he possesses a bachelor's degree in management and graduated from the prestigious FBI National Academy. Mr. Klug has been employed with the Minot Police Department for nearly 25 years, having served in all sorts of different capacities in his growth throughout the department, which has been just outstanding. Most recently, he served as captain, making him quite familiar with the city, its culture, its issues, its contracts, its local politics, and its local leaders. Currently, he holds more than 4,100 hours, 4,100 hours of formal certified law enforcement training. Absolutely impressive. In summary, he possesses the knowledge, skills, and abilities to become our next chief of police, and I am so thrilled that you've accepted the job. We'd like to formally recognize your acceptance of the position tonight by having a swearing-in ceremony. So if you and the mayor wouldn't, I'm going to flip the mic over here. I think the mayor is going to swear you in. Maggie, I think if you wouldn't mind as well, you want to come join. This is the chief's wife, right? So I think what we'll do is we'll have the swearing of the oath, and then Chief Olson will come up and he will do one pin and the badge. And then Maggie, if you wouldn't mind finishing it off, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
If you would, please raise your right hand. I state your name.
I, John Klug,
Do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
I will support the Constitution of the United States of America
I will support the Constitution of the United States of America
and the Constitution of the State of North Dakota
and the Constitution of the State of North Dakota
and ordinances of the City of Minot,
and ordinances of the City of Minot,
and I will honor the Peace Officers Code of Conduct
and I will honor the Peace Officers Code of Conduct
and faithfully discharge the duties
and faithfully discharge the duties
of the Officer of Chief of Police
of the Office of Chief of Police
in the County of Ward
County of Ward,
and the State of North Dakota
State of North Dakota,
according to the best of my abilities.
according to the best of my abilities.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Chief Klug.
only hurt for a minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, Chief John Klug.
Now, Chief, I'm only going to take a moment here, but for the citizens of Minot, on a national search of candidates that we had put out there to ensure that the very best for the position of chief was chosen. The finalist was a number of 3 different candidates, and I am just ecstatic to say that, of course, the best and brightest that has worked through our system and dedicated to the people of Minot rose to the challenge and absolutely was the best candidate for the position. So, Chief Klug, I am honored to have you accept this position. Of course, with anything with government, we have to always have paperwork. So I do need a signature from you, and we'll sign over here so that people can actually see, but we do need a signature to make it official. Chief, thank you again.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
If you would.
This has been, I had second thoughts about inviting the family. But no, it's really, without family, I probably would not be here. I've got my wife Maggie, my mom is here, my sister Nancy, my sister Amy, sister Mary, her husband Dean, my son-in-law, which is still weird to say, but son-in-law and my grandson, my daughter Mackenzie in the back, my sister-in-law Peggy, my brother Tim, my cousin Lance, my sister-in-law Paula, and my brother Bill. Of course, a lot of other friends that came out tonight. I appreciate you taking time. My Lieutenant Colonel Brandon McKinnon, I'm the honorary commander for their unit on the Air Force Base, 791st Missile Security Forces Squadron. Thanks for showing up today. My colleagues, my coworkers, you deserve this. You deserve everything that we're about to go through together. Trust me. But it'll be a good time. I look forward to the challenge. City Council, Mayor, City Manager, thank you. And thanks for the selection committee. Have a good evening.
Well, thank you, Chief. We have just one last slide here. This is a promotional video, very short, just to advertise the State of the City event, which, of course, again, is Thursday this week. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. We do hope to see everybody at the State of the City event. Mr. Mayor, City Council members, that's all I have for you tonight, unless you have questions for me.
Any questions for our city manager? Yes, Alderman Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Tom, if you and Mr. Zakian, prior to the February 24th special NDR meeting, could get us an updated budget of where we stand and kind of the benchmarks that are on the horizon. I think many of us are looking forward to that frank conversation and discussion about priorities and wants and needs, and I find that I'm going to want to look at the numbers prior to, please, sir.
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Straight, we'll absolutely do that. It was my intention to have that for you at the meeting, but I appreciate the reminder. We can get it to you in advance. That way you can be thinking about it certainly before the meeting. We'll do that.
Further questions for our city manager? Thank you, Tom.
Great, thank you.
At this point, typically, we don't try to usher people out, but to the chief and his family, we understand that there might be a celebration afterwards. So this is one time we'll allow willingly the chief to exit out gracefully. But I understand he does have someone in his absence staying with us. With that, that is the entirety of the city manager's report. We also have the city attorney's report this evening.
Mr. Mayor and members of council, I submitted a written report. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for our city attorney? Seeing none, that takes us to number 6 on our agenda. This is the consent items. We had 19 different items on our consent. Are there any individual items that need to be pulled for consideration tonight? Yes, Alderman Walski.
I've had, let me just get the numbers. 614 was the compactor, and 67 was the proposed ordinance line items over budget.
6.7 and 6.14. All right. Any other individual items out of the consent?
Move consent on the remaining items, Mayor?
Second.
Motion by Alderman Pittner, consent on the remaining items as recommended, second by Alderman Janser. Any discussion on the motion? Any discussion on the motion? Please call the roll.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson. Yes.
Motion is approved. 6.7 is the 2019 proposed ordinance line item over budget. Department budget must reflect the correct amounts for the 2019 CAFR. Adjustments are necessary so that no department reports amount that are not appropriated. The recommendation to council is to pass the ordinance to amend the 2019 annual budget and adjustment department budget for the funds approved by the city council for sales tax, flood control, various grants, library, memorial, and interest distributions.
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Janser, second, I didn't catch that, Alderman Walski. Discussion, Alderman Walski.
Yeah, Mayor Sitma, thank you. Chatting with our finance director, Mr. Lakefield, in front of the meeting, I just wanted to call attention to the council to what's maybe a modest and policy change sort of embedded in this document, which is sort of the discontinuation of like our street improvement fund and our sidewalk fund, and it got my attention, and so I just requested that Mr. Lakefield provide comment on a new practice as a result of our upcoming software change.
Mr. Lakefield.
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Wolski, this is a little bit of some house cleaning items. In the past, due to some limitations with software and tracking abilities, some of these items were segregated in their own fund to enable us to better track those items. The sidewalks and the street improvements that Mr. Wolski referred to are typically general fund activities and would normally belong in the general fund. And in anticipation with our updates with the software project that we are going through, we are now cleaning up our chart of accounts and rectifying some of these issues. We anticipate that we will have better capabilities in the future to track these things as we go. So we're cleaning up some of these funds that aren't really funds and putting them back where they should be.
Thank you. Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, thank you. I appreciate the explanation, Mr. Lakefield. There's just one other item that I kind of wanted to call attention to, and this is really just sort of speculative, but in the or the odd chance that some of these funds may have been sort of intentionally or directed by a past council or set up by those folks, I think it's just appropriate to acknowledge sort of maybe what's happened to them in the evolution of our finance and accounting. So.
Mr. Sitman and Alderman Wolski, we do intend to keep track of those funds. It'll be a manual process, at least initially in the interim, but we do plan on tracking those funds as well.
Okay. Any further discussion? Further discussion? Please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson. Yes. Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes. Motion is approved. 6.14 is the landfill compactor lease project number 4508. On January 28th, 2020, the Public Works Department opened the lease proposals for a landfill compactor for the landfill. 5 bids were received, and they are listed in the handout. The recommendation, council award the 5-year lease to Butler Machinery in the amount of $145,000 per year for the CAT 836K landfill compactor.
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Janser, second by Alderman Walsky. Discussion, Alderman Walsky.
Mayor Sitma, thank you. A request for future items attached like this. As we see the annual lease numbers in the bids and then the buyout numbers, I would appreciate Jason, Dan, Lance, anybody who might be associated with bringing these forward to seeing sort of the basis for our decision in terms of which of these numbers we're using as our basis for decision. Again, if we were to look at this and contemplate the buyout, we might come up with a different alternative as opposed to the one that's being selected. So, I just want to see, I want to see the reasoning behind the selections we're making in these decisions.
Further discussion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson. Yes. Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes. Motion is approved. That takes us to items number 7 on our agenda, 7.1. These are action items. 7.1, the 2020 through 2024 Capital Improvement Plan Adoption 4499. In 2019, city staff developed a new capital improvement plan, the CIP process. The new process added a significant amount of detail for each project in an effort to become more transparent. Staff has continued this approach in developing the 2020 through 2024 CIP. The recommendation to council is to adopt the CIP that is proposed in front of us.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Olson to approve, second by Alderman Pittner. Discussion on the motion. Any discussion? Alderman Walsky.
Mayor Sitma, thank you. This is I'm appreciative of this new process that we are going through. I met with our city engineer, I think back in October or November, and Mr. Meyer did some excellent due diligence on bringing forward some numbers associated with some projects that I would like to see contemplated by the council in more detail. I don't want to introduce those in a form of amendment tonight because I don't think that's appropriate. But I would, and I think it's appropriate to pass this and get it moving. But I would like to request staff bring us some actionable items in maybe the next 2 to 4 weeks so that we, the council, can have a discussion on them. One would be potentially to move up the date of the Ann Street Bridge project. Right now, it's scheduled for 2023, I believe. I think we have a logistics opportunity right now associated with the Phase 4 flood protection, the Phase 1 flood protection project. And if there is an opportunity to get that bridge open so that it can be open for a few years after the flood protection project is done, I think it makes sense for us to contemplate that. There was a phasing approach that was offered by our consultant last summer. It's a very expensive project, no doubt, but it can also perhaps be done in pieces. Number 2 would be, let's look for a funding source in the amount of $29,000 and consider updating our quiet zone study. Our quiet zone is the passage of trains through our downtown corridor. When they go through past a street, we know that they have to blow their whistles very loudly. And this is a study that has been done in the past, but it's in need of an update. Mr. Meyer got us a quote that it was approximately $29,000 to update that would allow us to, I think, begin seeking funding sources for that work more aggressively. And then the third item I would like the council to consider and contemplate is seeking funding or identifying funding for a corridor study for First Avenue Northeast. This is essentially from 3rd Street over to Main Street and then also over to the Amtrak Depot. This road is largely, in many cases, controlled by the railroad, but there are some some of the areas that are in private sector hands or private property owner hands. It's a complicated project in many ways, but I think we should get the planning started. The timing is very good, I think, in terms of doing this planning in conjunction with some of the flood protection planning that's going to start taking place there. I also noticed in passing the 3rd Street Viaduct recently that the elevator just north of the old Bridgman Creamery is now for sale. I think as we imagine what might happen in downtown, I think there's a lot of pieces in play right now that might be appropriate to contemplate this project. So I think the $200,000 was expected to be the upward side, the upward end of that particular cost. And these are, I think, priorities that as I think, contemplate a period where I'm very likely not on council. They're very important to me, and I would like to see the council take action one way or another.
Further discussion? Alderman Padugula.
Yeah, I also wanted to thank the staff for the comprehensive study, and I think the manager especially for the objective criteria that we've set up to rank projects. I also wanted to point out that there may be some things that we should be thinking about, like Alderman Walski said, that don't quite fit the framework. One of the things I'm thinking of, for example, is that extension of, I think it's Sunset Boulevard between the northwest neighborhood and whatever the big avenue is with the Caribou and the grocery store and the St. Alexius Clinic. I've talked at length over the years with the city engineer about that, and he's convinced me that it's not a rational project until we know what's developing, but it's also a real pain in the neck for the people who live in that neighborhood, have all that dust, and we spend a lot of time oiling the road and grading it, and it's been there for years and years and years. And I understand the rationale. Lance explained it very nicely, and it certainly doesn't fit in terms of the objective criteria. But I think there are occasionally projects like that we may be personally familiar with that merit some discussion for potential placement on that list. I don't think it should be kind of a political thing, if you will, or a favoritism thing. But I think in our knowledge of the community and our reaching out to residents, in terms of our own values, there may be things that really deserve some discussion, and that Sunset Boulevard is one of them for me personally. And there may be others for the rest of us. So I very much like the numbers-driven approach, but I think there should be a time, perhaps during one of our retreat meetings, to think through it. This capital improvements plan is very, very extensive, and I certainly, like Alderman Walski, don't want to delay its implementation. But there may be some things like that maybe we should look at as a potential wish list or talk about as a whole, rather than being numbers and formula-driven on everything.
Further discussion? Any further discussion? Alderman Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. For my 2 cents on some of Alderman Walski's points, and that was always the fascinating thing to me as we were contemplating a gathering space within the NDR application, was how were folks and residents from town, especially pedestrians, supposed to get to the gathering space. And with the Ann Street Bridge being down, now there's a new discussion about the underpass under the rail tracks under the 3rd Street Bridge. That's why I want to see if we can link some of these things together. I'm looking at our traffic engineer, Mr. Jors, because we've talked about pedestrian traffic in the past, and I think we just have to get creative of how we approach some of these things, sir. And if we do build a gathering space, or if the Minot Public decides that they want to have a middle school downtown instead of a high school, I can only envision that we're going to have more kids probably walking, biking to school. So that's why I want to see if there's an avenue to pursue some of these as well. So thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Further discussion? Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Olson? Yes. Pittner?
Yes.
Padugula?
Yes.
Straight?
Yes.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
Yes.
Janser?
Yes.
Motion is approved. 7.2 on our agenda tonight is the City Hall security upgrades. There have been a number of instances in the last year where individuals have come into City Hall and have been very hostile. The police department has been called to assist on a number of those occasions. These upgrades would secure areas of City Hall so that visitors would be screened before being allowed into the secured area. There are 2 Recommendations: approve the bids received for construction, installation of the City Hall security upgrades, and 2, pass an ordinance on first reading, amend the 2020 annual budget to increase the property maintenance, buildings, and grounds revenues and expenditures for the City Hall security improvements.
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Straight to approve.
Second.
Second by Alderman Pittner. Alderman Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to comment and commend staff in particular that I'm incredibly supportive of this. Staff safety, first and foremost, I think is paramount. And I wanted to comment more maybe to the audience that's watching at home that oftentimes when we have public appearances and folks get up and may seem agitated, I've heard some comments recently that disturb me a little bit because at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and we're going to go through security protocols and we're going to put protections in place for staff, but let's not forget that all residents have a right to, in their own manner, come before us to discuss or challenge some of our views, and I would hate for us to get into a more rigid state where we're not recognizing that folks have differences, and oftentimes the initial perspective sets people aback and scares, and sometimes I think that we just have to, it's incredibly challenging, Mr. City Manager, but I encourage you and the staff to just keep that in mind as we proceed with staff safety is paramount, but we also want to encourage still participation, and for folks watching at home, Mr. Mayor, you in particular have been kind to give folks ample and oftentimes more time at the mic during personal appearances, and sometimes we have to make exceptions for folks might come at their comments in a different manner. And so I want to stand, and I'm incredibly supportive of this, but I just want to be mindful of some of those folks in the public that have a real hard time kind of conveying without getting animated, frustrated, and sometimes agitated. So, thank you, sir.
Further discussion on the motion. Further discussion on the motion. Seeing none, please call the roll.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson. Yes. Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula.
Yes.
Motion approved. 7.3 is the Citywide Asset Management Software Vendor Selection 4423. Since 2017, the city has been planning and budgeting for an enterprise asset management and land development software to modernize the city's operations side of the organization. The city's RFP listed 4 primary components for vendors to submit proposals on, and these components include asset management, fleet and fuel management, citizen management, and permitting and land development. There are 2 recommendations before us. The recommendation for council to approve the following contracts and authorize the mayor to sign those contracts. Those are listed individually on the packet and those online. The second recommendation is the council pass a budget amendment ordinance on first reading to move the budget funds into the engineering department budget. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Janser for approval, second by Alderman Straight. Discussion on the motion. Any discussion on the motion? Alderman Janser.
I just want to commend the staff on doing the assessment of the various vendors and coming to a choice for this. It's tough work, but if we're going to move forward, if we're going to automate, if we're going to improve processes, we need the software tools to do that. And whether it's city government or a small business or a large business, you have to make investments in the automation tools to be able to be more efficient and to have more information available. And so I think this is a good point to get to and a good step to take.
Further discussion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson. Yes. Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula.
Yes.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes. Motion is approved. That takes us to 7.4, the Parking Authority bookkeeping duties. Prior to 2014, the Parking Authority had a full-time parking manager and a part-time recording secretary. Upon their departure from City Hall, their responsibilities were taken over by a member of the Park board in the interim, parking board in the interim. Phil Schultz took over these duties in October 2019. The bookkeeping duties and responsibilities are listed on the attached email correspondence. 3 recommendations before us. Recommend the approval of the proposed ordinance amending the 2020 annual budget for the first reading for the Parking Authority bookkeeping duties. Second is recommend for approval of $200 per month compensation to Phil Schultz for those bookkeeping duties. And 3, recommend approval for the use of the Parking Authority cash reserves.
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Olson for approval. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Alderman Janser. Discussion. Alderman Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to commend you, sir, as we had a conversation prior to about this agenda item, and I look forward, moving forward to maybe once we get out of some litigation with some other parking challenges, that there can be a larger conversation about parking, this authority, staff's role. Clearly this, to some maybe who don't know the ins and outs, look at it and are wondering, what the heck is this? But it is a standalone board, sir, and I do commend you at having this on your radar for a future conversation down the road, so thank you.
Further discussion on the motion? Any further discussion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson. Yes. Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula.
Yes.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes. Motion approved. 7.5 is the amend voluntary acquisition policy on foreclosed properties. To acquire properties that are considered spot blight, the city can only use voluntary acquisition under the Federal Uniform Relocation Act, or URA, because North Dakota Century Code does not permit use of eminent domain to acquire such properties. The city has been made aware of the properties not identified through the city inspection records, which meet the standards of spot blight and are a threat to neighborhood stability. This property was taken over by the VA, and since there is no property owner involved, what is considered just compensation under the federal URA changes significantly, become far more flexible in terms of the acquiring at distressed purchase pricing. The recommendation before the council is the city council will approve amending the CDBG DR NDR voluntary acquisition policy to add setting purchase price standards for blight properties which have been foreclosed. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Janser, second by Alderman Olson. Any discussion on the motion? Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sima, thank you. First of all, just kind of a point of process here that I think sometimes we on council don't always fully acknowledge or overlook. And I understand the need and desire to update a particular portion of this policy through an amendment. But I think we need to be conscious of the fact that when we do that, we are in essence providing a stamp of approval on the larger policy. And so tonight, what's contemplated is an action on the, how's it phrased, the voluntary acquisition policy on foreclosed properties. But what's in front of us for a document is actually the program for voluntary acquisition of real estate. And this is an item that has been a discussion piece for us over the past few months as we have contemplated gathering space, as we have contemplated City Hall, a voluntary acquisition of real estate. My understanding, those projects would all fall under this particular policy. And I have some concerns because the draft of this document, or the version of this document that I have been working off of, is a little bit different than the document that I have here this evening in terms of what I've reviewed. So I would want to request that before council take action on this and before I vote on this, I want to see a track changes document because I want to be able to look back and see in terms of what I've been looking at, whether that's, I think it's entirely possible that I've had the wrong document for the last 5 months. And so that's a concern to me. I want to reconcile that particular challenge or that particular concern. I also, as I look at this document here tonight, it says it was amended and approved on September 4th, 2018. I went back and I looked at our records from September 4th, 2018, and I couldn't find any particular changes associated with this document on our past agendas. So again, maybe just a clerical mistake or a date that got wrong, that got misplaced somewhere. But I think for due diligence, I would feel better asking Mr. Zakian, Ms. Patalka to go back and get us a little bit of a longer record on some of this. I bring it up because at one point last fall, I had contemplated offering a motion associated with requiring a appraisal as a standard practice, a part of real estate acquisitions. I'm not sure if that's reflected in here, as I caught some of these sort of what I would consider probably clerical and easily explained circumstances. I didn't get into the rest of the document. So with that, I would offer a motion to table this until such time as a change tracking document has been provided to council and a little bit of research has been done on the history of this voluntary acquisition policy.
We have motion to table. Is there a second?
I'll second it so we can talk about it.
There is no motion to discuss tabling.
I'll withdraw my motion for discussion.
Is that? Okay.
Sure.
Okay. So that has been withdrawn, Mr. Zakian. One of the questions that I have regarding that is this acquisition policy to add setting the purchase price standard for blight properties which have been foreclosed selectively to the CDBG DR NDR program? Is that specific to this?
Mayor Sitma, yes, it is specific. What we're doing is, all that's being requested tonight is that we add an additional provision to the existing voluntary acquisition policy. And that is simply that when a property comes before the city that meets blight standards, and that has been foreclosed upon, so that it's no longer owned by an individual or a corporation, but is owned either by a bank or a public agency or a Fannie Mae or something like that, that we follow a policy of making a fair offer based on the cost that they had for acquiring it, which is always way below what current market value is. I would also note that I understand, and I can answer the other questions, but I do want to point out that time is of the essence, because we have been made aware of a property that we can acquire that it definitely meets the blight standards, that was not identified by the city in its past records as being a blighted property.
Questions for Mr. Zakian? Alderman Pittner.
Thank you, Mayor. John, with these, with using these funds, remind me again, can these properties be sold or removed, or will they be removed from the tax roll and come under city control for the foreseeable future or indefinitely?
Mayor Sitmer, Alderman Pittner, these properties, since they're not being acquired under the urgent need flood acquisition or LMI, we have the ability to dispose of them. Any properties we acquire under spot blight, we will auction. And if you recall, you had actually established a policy several months ago where we have actually successfully sold to. They can do one of two options. They can either buy it to build a new single-family home that has to meet the elevation standards, or they can buy it in the neighbor next door program, which you had also adopted, which means a property owner can buy it and maintain it as green space. But yeah, the intent is to acquire these properties, demolish the unsightly structures, and then put them back on the tax rolls if we can. Mayor Sitman, if I could, I can clarify two things. I caught what Alderman Wolski caught. I caught also at this. When we post these on site, on the website, we have been putting the effective date as the date they actually are posted on the website, because there's always a period of up to a week prior to. In this case, it was the previous council meeting where there were some amendments made to the voluntary acquisition program, but it wasn't posted until the date that was shown on the website. What I'm going to do retroactively going forward, both for voluntary and involuntary, is put a notation on when it was posted and also when this was approved by the council. I also want to point out that the voluntary acquisition policy that is before you is the one that's on the city website and has been for some time.
Further questions for Mr. Zakian, Alderman Straight?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, John, do we not have funds in any other buyout bucket? We're making a change here for a one-off?
Mayor Simmer, Alderman Straight, actually, we do have, this is, to be clear, this is not coming out of the NDR funds. This is coming out of allocation one, and we have set aside, you originally set aside almost 18 months ago now, $800,000, about which we've spent about half to acquire Spotlight properties. So how you can be assured that this is only going to relate to allocation one and not to NDR is that any acquisition has to be driven by a national objective. Only allocation one can use Spotlight as the national objective. So we cannot touch NDR funds to acquire zombie properties. All NDR funds have to be devoted to acquisitions for flood control projects. What occurred here was we have established a very good, and I want to give them credit, we have established a very good relationship with most, if not all, of the major brokers, real estate brokers in Minot. They're aware of this program. As they become aware of a property that they believe may be Spotlight, they will alert us. This property was not on any of our lists, not on code lists, not on violation lists. It was brought to our attention because the broker that handles V8 foreclosures alerted me to it. And we did a deep dive, and it turns out this property has been vacant. It was a home. It has been vacant since the flood. It has never been rehabilitated. And so it has been unoccupied since 2011. So it definitely meets the Spotlight standards. What this tells me is that there may be other properties out there that we need to be prepared to go after that are not on the current list. I also plan to have a conversation, he's already indicated he's very interested in doing this, with our Community and Economic Development Director to see if we can maybe spread our net wider, especially on the inspection side, to try to catch these homes that may still be out there that have just kind of not been caught on the radar, have kind of been falling below the radar. And this is one of those properties.
Alderman Straight?
Thank you, John. Just for a follow-up, why was the address not included then?
Because it's still, I'd be glad to give it to you, but it's, it's going to be negotiated.
Further questions for Mr. Zakian? Thank you, John. Further discussion on the motion to approve? Any further discussion? Alderman Wolski.
Mr. Mayor, seeing no other discussion, I would like to renew my motion to table for 2 weeks and for the requests that I made, and that would allow me to feel more comfortable supporting this in the future.
We have a motion to table. Is there a second? Is there a second? Is there a second? Motion to table dies for failure for a second. We are back to our original motion to approve as recommended. Seeing none, Alderman Patagula.
Normally, I'm very much a defender of process, but I didn't second Alderman Walski's motion because staff told us time is of the essence. And I think if we hear that from our staff, that is something I want to pay attention to. I would ask staff, though, to respond to Alderman Walski's motion and present a cleaned-up copy of the rules and the policies as soon as they can in a timely fashion. I don't want to hold up a project that, again, is time sensitive. But I think we need to satisfy the request of one of our members for a clean copy of what we're going to be considering in the future.
I think Mr. Zakian will certainly be happy to help out there. Further discussion? Alderman Straight.
Mr. Mayor, I guess just moving forward, I would like to see addresses attached here. I think you can get into a situation where the public would very much question our motives if we don't have addresses connected with these motions and decisions. It seems it could just appear that it's on the books for any instance that might pop up, if you will, sir. So I'm uncomfortable with not having an address attached to this. So, for what it's worth, sir.
Mr. Zakian, it might just be a nod if correct. This still has to come back before us for the acquisition in question for this item, for approval.
Mayor Sitman, no, it doesn't have to come back. However, I have no problem. We can add that to the item. I have no problem putting the address on the item. And if you want to acknowledge that as part of the, I acknowledge that I will do that if this is approved. I have no problem adding it.
Thank you, Mr. Zakian. Further discussion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski,
No.
Sitman.
Yes. Motion is approved. That takes us to 7.6, the authorization of the CDBG NDR substantial amendment for urgent need. One of the basic requirements of HUD rule is that all activities in an action plan, except planning and administration, must have one or more national objectives, which are urgent need, low moderate income LMI, and blight includes spot blight. To be able to use NDR funds outside of buyout area 4. It is necessary to amend the action plan to add urgent need as a national objective. Recommendation before council is to authorize a substantial amendment to the CDBG NDR action plan to add the national objective of urgent need to the involuntary acquisition activity.
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Janser to approve.
Second.
Second by Alderman Olson. Discussion on the motion. Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, thank you. A question for Mr. Zakian. Kind of just curious as to why this particular item is being advanced in front of our larger NDR discussion in a couple weeks.
Mr. Zakian.
Mayor Sitma, Alderman Wolski, for two reasons. One is that this simply gives us another option. It is not a financial or fiscal commitment. Currently, I apologize, I sound like a broken record, but most action plans in CDBG, DR, and NDR throughout the country automatically include urgent need as an option because that is a catch-all. It gives you, as the city council, the flexibility of deciding where and how money should be moved, and you know that as a catch-all for any possible action taken in the future, that you will be able to use that as the national objective. For some reason, for acquisitions under the NDR action plan, only LMI was identified as a national objective. And as a result of that, and as a result of establishing that this particular buyout, number 4, met a standard known as low and moderate income area, we can only acquire property using NDR funds that are inside buyout area 4. Now, anticipating that in 2 or 3 weeks we will be having a discussion, I wanted to assure that you had maximum opportunity as quickly as possible based on what you wanted to decide. If you wanted to move money around, how to do that. Now, this is literally a 3-word amendment. Unfortunately, it is required. It also is required as a substantial amendment, not a technical amendment, because it is adding a national objective. But it also will mean that I can literally start this tomorrow and we'd be 3 weeks into the process. And it would, as far as I can tell, be a very seamless standard approval by HUD. So this would be a very fast track one. But again, to answer your question, Alderman Wolski, the main reason this is on is because it's appropriate. It should have been done in the first place. It wasn't. And as we discuss in 3 weeks options, I would much rather be able to say to you, you now have this option already in place, rather than say, well, you know, we may have to throw this as an option out.
Further questions for Mr. Zakian? Alderman Straight.
Mr. Mayor, John, I appreciate that statement. I caught in your memo that this is in part because of the recent change to including the BNSF project and the possible additional $30 million that we might have to come up with for flood protection. And it's frustrating, and I'm angry that we are going to have a special city council meeting to contemplate a tremendous amount of hard work that went into the NDR application and projects that could benefit this community, and possibly shelf those now because BNSF is not happy with the project. and doesn't want to participate on a larger level. And we are now going to scrap dollars possibly out of a project that came out of our natural disaster that devastated our community to help accommodate their greed, for lack of a better word. So, John, I appreciate you moving us ahead and giving us all of the options when it comes time to the NDR discussion, but I'm angry about it because, you know, we can talk all we want about priorities and needs, gathering space, city hall, homeless shelter, but buying out people's properties is serious business. And it's really incredibly disheartening. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Further discussion or questions, I guess, for Mr. Zakian? Thank you, John. A few quick words on this myself, and appreciating the avenue of course, Alderman Straight here regarding, I think, some anger and angst on the issue. Just looking at the dynamics of really how the community, our community needs have changed since the original application was even brought forward, and how much has evolved in that amount of time, good, bad, or otherwise. Looking at the ability that we're going to need to be, I think, as fluid as we can with the NDR and the time that we have left, I'm supporting it for that reason. Any further discussion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson, Yes. Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Straight,
No.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes. Motion is approved. That is the end of our action items. This takes us to number 8, personal appearances. This is an opportunity for anyone in the audience to come forward and speak in on any item that is on or not on our agenda this evening. Again, under personal appearances, this is an opportunity for anyone to come forward and speak on any item that is either on or not on our agenda. Seeing none, miscellaneous and discussion items. 9.1 is the Souris River Joint Board Quarterly Report. I think we do have a handout that is in front of us that was handed out by Mr. Ackerman prior to the meeting. Thank you, Ryan, and I believe that you have a presentation for us.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Alderman. My name is Ryan Ackerman, work as the administrator for the Souris River Joint Board. Just some background to this update. On a quarterly basis, I've been appearing in front of the various county commissions just to kind of brief commissioners on basically the status of various phases of the project. So my intent this evening is to basically share that same flavor of information with you all. This is the first appearance by the joint board in front of the city to give you a briefing like this. So I would appreciate any feedback if you would like me to tweak this in any way. If we're going to do this on a regular basis, I want to make sure that I'm hitting those items that are of most value to you. So bear with me here a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to touch on 6 things this evening. First of all, give you an update on construction, where we're at with designing permitting for the project, where we're at with various acquisitions related to projects and phases outside the city limits of Minot. Give you an update on funding as we're seeing things from the federal, state, and local perspective. Brief the council on our engagement in the reservoir management activities that are going on right now at the international level. And then also give you an assessment of our belief of the flood outlook for 2020. First of all, in construction, as you're aware, we have basically 3 phases of the project that are actively in construction in Minot, phases 1, 2, and 3. Phase 1, of course, from Broadway to 3rd Street northeast, primarily flood walls on the north side of the river. Phases 2 and 3, primarily levees from the 83 bypass up to the CP rail crossing of the river. Additionally, there's one small sub-phase of the project that's under construction in Tierracita Vallejo. We have placed a pre-consolidation pile in that subdivision to basically prep a certain portion of that corridor for construction next spring on that particular phase. So with this, I'm going to give you a bit of a fly-through video here. We'll see if this pulls up. So taking a look first at phase MI1, and I'm not going to go through this entire video just in the brevity here, but I'm going to focus primarily on the activities that are occurring. So we do these drone flights on a regular basis. We do them monthly, and then we post the resulting video on the Mouse River Plan YouTube channel. So you can take a look to see the activities and the actions that have been going on with regard to this. So as the camera spins around here, context here, this is the 3rd Street Viaduct looking south right now, and it's going to spin around and look toward the west. You'll see a lot of the construction activity that is currently going on is placement of concrete associated with the flood walls along 4th Avenue. So this is an active concrete pour that's actually occurring when this flight was taken. You see a concrete truck backing down 4th Avenue to deliver fresh concrete to the crane that's placing that concrete into the forms that are there. So the contractor on this phase of the project is working to basically get the concrete flood walls done by this spring. Their intent is to wrap that up by late April, early May. And I'm going to fast forward through the rest of this and get to the other area of this project that is currently seeing a little bit of action, which is right at Broadway, and that's the construction of the Broadway pump station. On this, a lot of the work is concealed because it's happening inside of enclosures. So you'll see on this that there are a couple of sets of scaffolding that have been erected with some plastic enclosures. Basically inside of there is some concrete and masonry work that is being done. Additionally, a lot of the structural concrete for the access ramp into the large storm sewer that feeds into this pump station is being completed. I'm going to skip forward to the next one here. This next video is phase 2-3 of the project. This video is actually from right around the first of the year, so it is a little bit dated. This project, really the only areas that are still active are from the Perkett Pump Station, which you're going to see coming to the screen shortly, basically east to 16th Street and about 300 feet past 16th Street. That's the work that has yet to be completed. This is the Perkett Pump Station. This portion of the project is substantially complete and it is operational. So in the event that we do need that facility in the spring, it will be ready for us to use basically. One of the activities that didn't go exactly as planned in September was the seeding of the WeLinks golf course. That's coming up here on the flight. Basically, when that golf course was seeded, it was followed by 8 inches of rain in September. So based on the condition of that grass at freeze up, we think that there's a good chance basically that we're going to lose that and end up having to reseed that course. So that's going to set back the opening of WeLinks potentially by a couple of months. So we're bummed out about that. Fast forwarding here a little bit, we'll get up to the major bulk of the work of this phase, which is occurring right at 16th Street. Pleased to announce that 7th Avenue was opened last week to traffic. 16th Street and 7th Avenue was open. Basically, the work that's occurring in this area is utility relocations. There's the 30-inch raw water line that takes some time to relocate, as well as prepping for a relocation of the 36-inch NOS water line as well. This next phase of the project is substantially complete. This is just a quick overview of the new bridge out in Burlington on Colton Avenue or County Road 10A. Basically, what this phase of the project did was replace the hydraulic bottleneck in Burlington and replaced it with a bridge that's approximately 150 feet longer in length to add conveyance. That project was substantially completed in November and opened back up to traffic. There is some minor cleanup work that does need to be done. It was important that we build this phase of the project first because the levee system in Burlington, our intent is to source borrow material on the east side of the river. So the bridge would need to be in place to basically transport that borrow material into the city to build those levees. Just to kind of sum things up here on the construction side, like I mentioned, we do have a YouTube channel, Mouse River Plan, so you can basically track and follow those videos on a monthly basis. We upload those. We also have live construction cameras on the various phases of the project. I believe there are 3 or 4 cameras on phases 2 and 3 and 2 on phase 1. Those cameras take a still photograph every 15 minutes. So there is the ability to keep a keen eye, if you will, on all construction activities going on within the city of Minot. On the design and permitting front, the teams are working feverishly to complete the designs. Tierracita Vallejo, which is the levee system on the west side of Minot, it serves as the western tieback for Minot, is actually 100% designed. We are working through some acquisitions with that one, and we'll be ready to go out to bid hopefully sometime late this spring or early summer. Phase MI4, the Maple Diversion, that's the piece of the project that we believe has a federal interest. That's about 30% designed. We also did get notice from the Corps of Engineers last week that there may be potential funding coming from the federal government for the design phase of that project. That is something that they can basically fund prior to congressional authorization. So it could be a few $1 million for that coming our way from our friends at the Corps. Phase MI5, that was designed to 90%, but as you were informed here recently, we're looking at some other options there that would potentially minimize impacts to BNSF. So we say that's 90% designed with a very strong caveat. That's if we stay the course that we were on about 9 months ago. Another notable phase, the Burlington Levee, that is also 100% designed, awaiting some acquisitions before we can go out to bid on that one. So we do have a couple of major phases of the project that are on the shelf and ready to go. Alderman Janser, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. If the change to MI5 occurs where it, ends up going in the other direction, what kind of design time delay is that likely to pose? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I guess the design itself is likely to take about 12 months to complete. What I think is going to be on the critical path for that phase is actually going to be acquisitions.
Sure.
If agreements can't be made amicably. On the acquisition front, I mentioned this, the Joint Board actually completes property acquisitions for features located outside the city limits of Minot. So the acquisition team is working on completing acquisitions in Burlington, Tierracita Vallejo, and they also stand ready in the event that the council chooses to basically go down a different path with Phase MI5, because if that action is taken and we end up going on the north side of the tracks, there will be some acquisitions that are outside of city limits that the Joint Board will step in and take care of, basically. Related to acquisitions is the STAR program. This is the rural program for property owners that are basically left outside of the more community-based levee systems. This program is being closed out. We had it in existence for approximately 4 years. Throughout that process, we acquired 166 structures. We relocated 3 to high ground. We're in the process of getting a ring dike ready to build this spring. It's about a $12 million project program in total. Just one example here, the photographs on the right-hand side of the screen. The one on the left is from 2009, an aerial photo, and the house in question is where my cursor is at. It's this octagon-shaped house here. In 2011, when the flood came through, you can see the significant erosion and reroute of the river that occurred. That placed that property basically at risk. It eliminated the access to that property. So that was one property that we actually were able to relocate to high ground, and that's a photograph in the bottom there of us doing that through the STAR program. On the funding side, we are looking into potentially utilizing the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, or WIFIA, through the EPA. One caveat here is that traditionally this program has been set aside for water, wastewater, and stormwater systems, so flood control is kind of gray with regard to that. Certainly there are improvements that are related to water, wastewater, and stormwater, but not all of them. But we are looking into that as a potential means to finance our local share through long-term, low-interest loans. Also on the federal side, as you're aware, we've been engaged with the Corps of Engineers in the feasibility study. The preliminary indication is that if authorized and appropriated by Congress, there could be up to $56 million granted to the project to construct a portion of Phase MI4. With that, congressional authorization is anticipated to occur sometime this fall in the form of the next WRDA, Water Resources Development Act legislation. Following that, we will need appropriation as well. And we've developed a strategy in concert with Senator Hoeven's office to basically attempt to deliver the funding once Congress authorizes the project first. Additionally, the Corps of Engineers is in the process of standing up a program similar to EPA's WIFIA program, where it's a long-term, low-interest loan program. They're calling it the Corps Water Infrastructure Financing Program. The nice thing about it is that, again, it's long-term, low-interest loans available through the federal government, but flood control projects are explicitly called out as being allowable. So this would be something that would be a potential solution for us in the event that we need an option for long-term, low-interest loans, primarily to finance our local share. On the state side here, just to update you, the state's been a fantastic funding partner, the primary funding partner in this endeavor. To date, through appropriations made dating back to 2011, there's been about $262 million invested by the state of North Dakota. Within there as well, we've been talking within the last few years about the legislative intent adopted by the legislature approximately 3 years ago, in which they committed to delivering $193 million in total funding for improvements within the city limits of Minot from basically the 17-19 biennium through the 23-25 biennium. In 17-19, of the $63.9 million that was appropriated, $57.7 million, or 90%, went toward improvements in Minot. In the 19-21 biennium, there was a total of $82.5 million appropriated. $46.6 million of that, or 56% of that total, is associated with activities in Minot. So doing the math here with that legislative intent, we could expect that in 21-23 and 23-25, we would be appropriated a total of about $89 million to basically round out that legislative intent. On the local side, the Joint Board has formed a financing subcommittee chaired by our chairman, Mr. Ashley. Mayor Sitma sits on this, as well as Mr. Lakefield, your finance director, Ward County Commissioner Shelley Wepler, as well as Jason Zimmerman, who's a member of the State Water Commission and a Ward County Water Resource District board member. This group has been discussing long-term low-interest loan opportunities, including potentially working something through the Legacy Fund through the state, also WIFIA through the EPA, and the Corps Water Infrastructure Financing Program through the Corps. The group is also discussing local revenues, because we know that's something that is of concern to this council, certainly, is trying to figure out is there a more equitable way basically to split up our local share. Okay, I'm going to dive into just a little bit high level on the reservoir management side. Basically, the reservoirs above Minot that have flood control purposes associated with them are operated in accordance with an agreement that we signed with Canada back in 1989. This is a product of two projects, the Rafferty Alameda project, which was Canadian, and then also the Souris River Flood Control Project, which was basically implemented by the Corps of Engineers. A little bit of context here, first of all. Some people don't exactly understand why the reservoirs were built to begin with in Canada. They were not built for fishing. They were not built as dry dams. Okay. Rafferty Reservoir was built primarily to provide cooling water to the Shan Power Plant near Estevan. And the Alameda Reservoir, located near Alameda, Saskatchewan, was basically built so that Canada could satisfy the requirements of the Boundary Waters Treaty as it relates to apportionment. Canada is required to pass across the border into the U.S. a minimum of 50% of the natural flow. If they store all the water in Rafferty to basically provide cooling water, there was a chance that they would not be able to basically meet their apportionment requirements. That's why they built Alameda. So these were built as water supply reservoirs for Canadian purposes. And then we came to the table following the failure of the Burlington Dam project with $41 million to basically make those reservoirs larger. What we did was we basically bought storage in each one of these reservoirs. In Rafferty, we have about 14.8 feet as a minimum of available storage, and in Alameda, which is also known as Grant Devine now, there's about 19.7 feet minimum of storage. In the event that we go into flood operations, those reservoirs are actually drawn down below those numbers. So we actually gain additional storage according to those agreements. So following the 2011 flood, there was a request made by the Joint Board, the City of Minot, State of North Dakota, to basically reevaluate the operating plan. Following about a 6-year process, letters were issued by the State Department and Global Affairs Canada to basically initiate this study. And currently, the modelers are going bananas with a myriad of alternatives, basically, to figure out, is there a way to optimize water supply benefits and flood risk management benefits. I put a web link on here. Feel free to look at that tool at your leisure. In the interest of brevity, I won't dig into that. But basically, you can pull up these 100 or so different alternatives and basically compare them to baseline. And you'll see that with regard to 2011, there's not much difference that's going to occur with any of the alternatives being contemplated right now. Because these alternatives also preserve the Canadian purposes of water supply. That work is supposed to wrap up by the end of 2020, at which point basically those recommendations go to governments. Again, the State Department and Global Affairs Canada, and then those two entities work together to basically decide whether or not they want to change the agreement. So soup to nuts, this process is probably going to take 15 years to complete from when the initial request was made back in 2011. So you'll have to stay tuned for a while, I think, to see this finally play out. Finally, I want to brief you all on the flood risk outlook for 2020. There are a number of different risk drivers with regard to flooding, and I'm going to touch on, I guess what I'm going to say are the four primary ones here: soil conditions, snowpack, reservoir levels, and the long-term precip forecast. With regard to soil conditions, things are wet, especially here. The graphic that I've got shown on the screen here is basically precipitation in September as it relates to percent of normal. Red is indicative of 300% of normal precip, and that's what you'll see in a good chunk of northern North Dakota. In Minot here in September, we had 8 inches of rain. The good news is that as you travel north and farther up into the watershed, that rainfall amount in September basically tapered off to the point where in Estevan they had approximately 6 inches of rain, and in Weyburn they had about 4. So things tended to taper off, but the watershed is extremely wet. With regard to snowpack, there really isn't much out there, so that bodes really well for us. Currently, and this is a snapshot as of today, based on modeled snow water equivalent in the watershed, there's less than 1/10 of an inch of precip average, of water average, basically over the entire basin, as compared to this same time in 2011, where basically there was 4.7 inches average or so over the entire basin above Minot. So, from that perspective, I think we're in pretty good shape with regard to the snowpack. There's also this link here that'll allow you to track that. We do update this on a weekly basis on mouseriverplan.com. With regard to reservoir levels, there's 3 reservoirs above Minot that provide some form of flood risk management benefit. Rafferty Reservoir, Grant Divine Lake, which is formerly known as Alameda Reservoir, and also Lake Darling. So give you an indication of where things are at with each one of those reservoirs. So this is a kind of a schematic, if you will, of Rafferty Reservoir. The current reservoir level in that is at about just under 1,802 feet. Just for context here, the maximum allowable flood level is about 17.6 feet. So currently we have about 15.8 feet of flood storage available within Rafferty Reservoir. One thing to note here is that Rafferty Reservoir is actually, it's about a foot below its normal drawdown level. So that is actually below the level prescribed in the '89 agreement. And based on current forecasts, the Canadian hydrologists are concerned that Rafferty will not fill to full supply level. That's that green dashed line, basically following the spring melt. So there's concern that there isn't enough water basically within the watershed to get that reservoir filled back up. So that's of concern to Canada. Grant Divine Lake similarly is drawn down basically to its normal drawdown level. There's about 19.6 feet of available storage in Grant Divine Lake. Lake Darling has very limited flood control storage. Although that's one that typically most of us are most familiar with, it is the smallest one on the system with regard to flood storage. Currently there's between about 5 and 6 feet of storage, but all 3 of these reservoirs, Rafferty, Grant Divine, and Lake Darling, are at basically their normal drawdown levels for this time of year. With regard to the long-term precip forecast here, what I've got on the screen now is a graphic of the Canadian 3-month forecast for February through April 2020. And what the green shading indicates is that basically they're saying there's about a 40% chance in our portion of the watershed that we could see above normal precip in the coming 3 months. The U.S. forecast differs slightly, but that also does indicate maybe a 30 to 40% chance of us seeing above average precip over the next 3 months. So just something to be mindful of. I guess as we kind of stack all the different risk drivers together, soil conditions are obviously very wet following the rains that occurred in September. Snowpack and reservoir levels were in really good shape there. Long-term precip forecast, I think it's just maybe some cause for concern. We need to just keep on paying attention to that particular risk driver. Also, today, the Saskatchewan Water Security Agency issued its first forecast. In the table here, and I just pulled this as a snapshot basically out of their report, but the right-hand most column in that table basically indicates the event return period. So when we talk about a 1 in 10 chance. Basically, at a 1 in 10 chance, that's when the reservoirs go into flood control operations, basically. Anything less than that, they don't go into flood control operations. What they're projecting, basically, for many points throughout the watershed is anywhere from a 1 in 2 event to a 1 in 5 year event. So really modest runoff based on conditions as of today. Now, clearly, this can all change. We need to be diligent of that. The take-home message here is not to be, don't buy flood insurance. Absolutely buy flood insurance. It's a good investment. Buy flood insurance. Keep flood insurance. But with regard to our planning for spring and things like that, I think things look very manageable from the flood risk management perspective. So, Mayor and City Council, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ackerman. I greatly appreciate the information. Questions from any of the council members for Ryan? Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, thank you. Mr. Ackerman, I greatly appreciate the update. I've caught these in the past at Ward County Commission, and I have appreciated them in that forum, and I think it's going to be valuable for the council, but also for the community. The communication tools that we have here in this room in terms of the streaming and the online distribution of this show, I think, or this meeting is extremely valuable for the community to see this. And I appreciate you going in a little more depth here in terms of talking about the operation and the purpose behind the Canadian reservoirs and their initial construction. I think that's a myth that has lived in this community going back a very long time, and the more we can dispel that myth, the better. So thank you for this first installment of this, and I look forward to these updates in the future.
Further questions, Alderman Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is going to seem ridiculous to all the people that know me and know that I want flood protection, I don't want buyouts. But Ryan, I've heard rumors that there might be some dollars available that we could possibly rework the coffer dam at the water treatment plant. Is there any rumors to that?
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Straight, the State Water Commission has set aside a specific amount of funding, and I can't recall exactly what that dollar amount is, but basically, the intent of that program is to address safety concerns associated with low-head dams. So the state has done an assessment of low-head dams throughout the state, and they have basically categorized and ordered these based on risk or perceived risk. And the low-head dam at the water plant is actually ranked #1 statewide with regard to risk, and that's not a good thing.
Yeah.
It's #1 being the most risky low-head dam in the state.
Thank you.
Further questions for Mr. Ackerman, Alderman Patagula.
Just to echo what Josh said, I really appreciate this briefing, and I think it'll be a good thing for everyone in the community to have these on a regular basis. It'll give us a valuable sense of perspective. The one ask I have is that when the Committee on Financing meets, if you could ask them, if I'm sure it will be brought up, but just I feel better if I ask for it, to look at enhanced funding by the counties affected. I've long felt that if you benefit from something, you should have some role in paying for it. Specifically, I would ask again for a dedicated allocation from each of the counties toward the project. 1 cent sales tax is something that's been mentioned. We have a 1/2 cent sales tax for the county administration building and jail, and we've talked about having that dedicated when that bill is paid for toward flood control, and asking citizens to approve that kind of a change. I personally think we really need to see something like that from the outlying counties. I realize it probably won't be a lot of money, but for me, it's the principle of the thing. And if we were just talking now about, because of BNSF's recalcitrance, spending maybe $30 more million, I think things like that become more important. On the broader scheme of things, with $1 billion, a few million here and there won't make much difference. But if we have an unexpected $30 million payment, a few million here, a few million there could make a difference. And you're already talking about a 15-year period to revise the flood manual, so to speak. Obviously the Minot city, not the local, the Minot flood improvements probably will take another couple decades. I think that's something that the area really needs to talk about and be very serious about. And again, I'm sure the focus really needs to be on those low-interest loans from the legislature and the federal government. But I think we also need to contribute, all of us in the basin need to contribute in a dedicated, guaranteed kind of fashion. So if you could just, on behalf of one alderman, if you could ask that to be considered and discussed and reconsidered again.
I will bring it up.
Thank you. Alderman Patagula and council, I would encapsulate just a little bit of conversation with other folks that I would say downstream regarding the enhanced Mouse River Flood Protection Project. In regard to the principle, absolutely, I can understand a lot of concern there. Discussions with other folks that are downstream also take a look at the cost share at 65%, which is higher at the state level, higher than what the general cost share is. Many folks at the state level also consider that contribution for the shortfall that likely wouldn't come from other counties that are affected. I'm also wary and very cautiously have these discussions only because principle could equal delay. If we look back at 1969, and it was referenced once already with the Burlington Dam. If we do see delay, it likely could be years. And we're also very aware of what is next on our agenda, the FEMA flood risk map updates. So I only ask that we all be mindful as we have those discussions, because there are lots of other impactful avenues that are happening, and it is a very, very involved, not only just within the city limits, but also throughout the entire basin that has much farther reaching implications even at the state level. To that end, Mr. Ackerman, I just have one question, and this might be a little bit of perception as you did spend time down at the last legislative session. Perhaps whether it be with the lawmakers that are on the State Water Topics Committee or maybe other committees that we all stood before and testified. Do you get a good feeling that a lot of those lawmakers understand the difference between some of the funding allocations that have taken place in proportionment to Minot and understand that that $88.7 million is still coming in the, I guess respectively speaking, over those next couple of bienniums, and I understand that a lot can change between different legislative sessions themselves, but if you could, just what's your feeling as far as the understanding of what was originally intended versus what has been allocated?
Mr. Mayor, I think you've picked up on a potential disconnect that does exist with certain legislators, excuse me. What we go on is basically what was prescribed in law, and the appropriations that have been made and the authorizations that have been subsequently made by the Water Commission toward various project elements. I think that is definitely an area that we need to focus our communication efforts on, and we're going to have that opportunity this summer when the Water Topics Overview Committee is in Minot in, I believe, August. They'll be in town, so we'll need to definitely bolster the communication on that end and make sure that everybody understands kind of where we're at and make sure that we're all reading the books the same way.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Further questions for Mr. Ackerman? Thank you, sir. I appreciate all the work that's gone into that. That takes us to our next item, 9.3, under our 9.2, I apologize. The NAS project update. Public Works Director, Mr. Dan Jonason, is here with an update on the NAS project currently under construction. or design, depending on which area we're talking about.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. Friday afternoon, the city clerk had sent out an update that I had received from Mr. Schemp from Tim Frigge that gives a little more detail on the projects. I'm gonna be a little more broad, probably at a 20 or 30,000 foot level as I go through these tonight. But as always, if you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Probably the biggest thing, and Tim Frigge gave an update at our water users conference in December, is the litigation that's been hanging over NAS. And thankfully, as I'm sure you're aware, it is done. All the appeals have been addressed, the litigation's been addressed, and that's why we are moving forward as expeditiously as we can to get as much of the NAS built as we can. It's just a brief overview project map of the NAS project. The green lines are items that have been constructed to date, and the red items are the items that we are working on, either under construction or design. The current projects that are under contract, 24A is a pipeline project that went from the Renville Corner to West Hope. That is actually functioning. We're pushing water through that to them as of a couple weeks ago. They finished all the flushing and the installation of the vault and getting electricity to it, so they have water there. 23C is another pipeline that kind of completes the loop of the NAS project between Lansford and Renville Corner. That was awarded. Kemper Construction has that. They were working on some of the bores under some of the roadways this winter. That'll be finished this fall, so that we will have a loop system on a good portion of the NAS. The water treatment plant expansion has been going on for a little over a year now, almost a year and a half, and it's probably 6 months or so behind schedule. It should be completed entirely in July, and we hope to at least be making water with it when our peaks start hitting us in the end of May, beginning of June. The state also had a raw water line condition assessment to take a look at the rest of the line that is being used from, or that needs to be used from where our Sundry line connects south of town down to the lake. They have found some minor areas in some of the vaults where some of the pipes were rusted out. They're being replaced, but the pipe so far itself in the ground appears to be in good shape. That should be complete this summer. Under design, the remaining pipeline contracts that goes from West Hope to Souris actually is not 90% anymore. They have completed that, and the Bureau is completing the review of that segment, and that's set to go out to bid in March. And then the segment from Souris to Bottineau to get water to them is about 60% designed, and we hope to have that out early spring for probably 2021 completion now, looking at that. Lansford Pump Station and Reservoir for the treated water. It's about a 4 to 6 million gallon reservoir and pump station that needs to be built to get the full allotment to Bottineau. We can get a limited amount there from the high service pump station, but due to the elevations, we need a booster station and reservoir there to get the full allotment to the folks up along West Hope, Souris, and Bottineau area and all seasons. That's about 60% complete, and we hope to have that bid in 2020. The Biota water treatment plant is about 90% designed. As you know, that will be constructed down just on the south side of Max. When you're going north towards Minot, when you come up the overpass at Max, on the right-hand side, the state has a plot of land there, and that's where the Biota plant will go. Again, that's being funded 100% by this Bureau. The state is advance funding that. Right now, that phase that we're looking at is about $50 million on the latest engineer's estimate. Snake Creek pumping plant intake modifications. The Snake Creek Station, essentially we'll take one of the pumps in there, take them out, and put 3 or 4 smaller pumps in there to feed the biota plant, because we can't start the plant up unless we got the water coming from the river. So that's a little shorter construction, probably a 1.5 year construction. So we're looking at also getting that bid out this year so that it's complete when the biota plant is done, so that we can fire the plant up and test it and start sending water to Minot for full treatment. South Prairie Reservoir and control structure, there's about a 10 million gallon reservoir, raw water reservoir that'll go down in there. The thoughts of that is we will have an average of our peak days production of water on hand in case something happens. We will be, supplementing all of the water that comes from the lake with our wells as part of the EIS. The lake water is a supplemental source to our well water for treatment for the region. It's about 20% complete. Probably end of 2020, that'll go out for bid if funds are available for that. Remaining project is there's still one phase of the Minot Water Treatment Plant that needs to be done. Phase 3, basically that'll take our existing softening basins and rebuild all of them. The Biota Treatment Plant has a phase 2 and 3 to build it out to its full potential, or 27 MGD capacity. Treated water reservoir up at Botno, and another reservoir boost station up at Souris on the way to Botno to help boost the water and take care of some of the hydraulic pressure and gradient pressure up there, and then some inline booster pump stations along Highway 5 so that when we get the loop in, we can get the water up around Kenmare and east, but to get it back, we need some pump stations in there, so we will be working on that. With that, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I would stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jonason. Alderman Straight.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Dan, can you remind the public what the cost share is on NAWS?
Currently, the cost share is 65-35, with the exception of the biota plant. That is being funded 100% by the Bureau and advance funded by the state, since the Bureau doesn't have the immediate funds available for that.
Alderman Straight, continue.
Thanks for the continuation. Mr. Jonason, how does that compare to, say, the bigger water diversion projects, say, in the eastern part of the state?
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Straight, they vary. There's kind of a hodgepodge of a little bit of everything. The Red River Valley water supply, initially the state had been funding 100% of that. I believe the last allocation, it's 90% funding. They're still looking at what their funding cost share is going to be on that. WAS has had a 75-25 cost share on some of it. Some of it, it's just been loans that they have to pay back. Southwest Water Supply, of course, is a state project, so it is 100% state funded. But some of the municipalities, Dickinson, some of those have shared in the cost of the upgrades to some of their water treatment facilities and things like that. So it does vary. There's no certain cost share for any one throughout it. Again, Grand Forks, their new water plant, it's different. They're funding about 50% cost share of that $160 million project. So it does vary quite a bit.
Thanks, Dan.
Further questions for our Public Works Director, Alderman Janser.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Dan, it seems to me like when I looked at your report that you had sent out, and I saw the $56 million number, or whatever it was, for the treatment plant, or the biota plant. I was a little surprised by that, because I thought at some point we had heard that number was going to be higher than that. Is that, or is there a piece of, is that piece 1 and there's piece 2 and 3 coming?
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Janser, you're exactly right. This is just piece 1 of 3 pieces for the plant. Right now, that's probably going to be a neighborhood of $100 million plant when all the pieces are done. But the first segment, I said now with the latest revised estimate that I saw is just a little over 50 million.
Thank you. That's what I remembered.
Director Jonason, as far as the O&M on specific to the Biota plant and just operation, if you could, is that staying with the federal government?
Mr. Mayor, the O&M for the Biota plant is the federal government's responsibility, all of that. As far as the rest of the NOS system, they do collect an O&M. We pay it. All the entities that get water through it pay it. They have an OEM and an REM. So right now, about 41 cents a thousand goes into account that they have set aside for OEM and REM of the NOS system. But yes, right now, the federal government has, the Bureau of Reclamation has said that they are responsible for the operation costs for the Biota plant and the construction.
Okay, thank you. Alderman Padugula.
Just a quick idea here. When, I know this is all tentative, but when do you think we can expect the first gallon of water to come up from the lake to our treatment plant?
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Padugula, I would say there's a pretty good chance we could see it mid-2023.
Thank you.
Any further questions for Director Jonason? Seeing none, thank you, Dan, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now that takes us to 9.3 on our agenda, the FEMA risk update. This is 3888. Informational purposes here, and we have our city engineer, who is our city flood map administrator as well here for an update on the process and timeline for the new flood insurance rate maps for the city of Minot. Good evening, Lance.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of council. You're getting the 1-2-3 punch on water tonight, so I'll finish her off for the city. But we want to take this opportunity to update you on our risk map project that we've undertaken with Ward County and FEMA and the state. And really what we're working with here is, currently we have a set of 20-year-old maps. The maps that we regulate to were established in the year 2000, which doesn't seem that long ago, but it is 20 years now. Just a lot of different technology that was used. We've had a series of modeling updates and aerial photography and LiDAR and things that now give us the ability to make much more accurate maps. And so that's a good thing for us because it models our risk much more realistic. So stepping back through time here, this project actually started in 2006, if you'll believe that, so 14 years ago. And it was just going to convert those 2,000 maps into a digital format. That was all the project was. And in 2011, that changed with our flood. The state and FEMA wanted to take a look at a full evaluation of our maps. So they did all new hydrology and hydraulics, new LiDAR, bathymetry, and everything that goes into making these new maps. And for the next 10 years, that's basically what we've been working through is developing these new maps in partnership with FEMA. If you'll remember back in July of 17, we had our public open house meeting to take a look at these preliminary maps. And in November of that year, we submitted several comments to FEMA to address some issues that we had found. Over the process of or time period of about a year and a half, we've been able to delay the maps and refine them and make them a much more usable product, more information, newer information. And that brings us to where we're at now, and we have those preliminary maps. They've been distributed to us, and we're ready to take a look at those. So as the map starts to populate here on our GIS, essentially when we submitted these comments to FEMA about a year and a half ago, they really revolved around three primary areas. One of those were the existing levees and how those are modeled throughout the communities. There's some updated guidance that FEMA had issued, and we requested that guidance be followed. We've acquired a tremendous amount of property in the valley, these flood buyout areas that that you'll see around the city. We wanted to be able to utilize those as by expanding the floodplain. And what that does is it helps reduce the expanding the floodway in those areas, which reduces the floodway impacts throughout some of the neighborhoods in Minot. So we're successful in reducing some of that floodway impact. And then finally, in the 20 years since some of these areas were reviewed and modeled, there's been a tremendous amount of infrastructure changes, new pipes, new bridges, that sort of thing that we wanted to make sure were incorporated into those maps. So where we are today, so we have the new maps. Essentially, we, like I mentioned at last council meeting, we're in line to be published in the Federal Register. And that should happen sometime here this month or early March. That's important because then it starts the 90-day clock that we have for appeals. And if the city would not utilize an appeal, then probably sometime later this summer, we'd be in a position where FEMA would be ready to issue us what's called a letter of final determination. That means all the comments, all the questions, all the appeals have been addressed, and these maps are essentially a final product. We then have 6 months to adopt those. So we could adopt it the day we get the letter, or we could wait 6 months and adopt it at that point. But we'll have to amend our ordinances, and then in that time period, obviously we want to ramp up the public outreach and make sure people understand that they need to obtain flood insurance policies if you live in these newly mapped areas, just because of the grandfathering benefits. It's tremendous, and it's an opportunity that cannot be overemphasized. And then, of course, once those new maps go effective, we're anticipating in that February timeframe of 2021. If you have a federally backed mortgage and you're in a high-risk area, then you will be required by your lending institution to have mandatory flood insurance. And then on the regulation side, we have to regulate to the new maps. So all the building restrictions and things that come with building in the floodplain have to be enforced by us. I wanted just to take a little bit of time to talk about the appeal process that we have. So like I mentioned before, it's a 90-day window. And appeals are much different than comments. Before, when we were going through this process, anybody could make a comment. You could make a comment, I could, the general public can make a comment. Maybe a street name was labeled wrong or something like that. Now, the appeals had to be submitted by a licensed professional engineer, and they have to be backed with all the analysis that goes into making that technical argument. So obviously with that, the big takeaway with this is if the city Minot is going to submit any kind of appeal, essentially we have to recreate what FEMA produced in that 9-year period in 90 days. And so the timing of that is very important. The cost of that is going to be expensive. We would anticipate a range of $150,000 to $200,000 to try to replicate that effort in such a short amount of time. Likely what would happen as we work through an appeal process is at some point we would have to go to what's called the scientific review panel. And really what that is, it's an independent body that FEMA set up. It's a way for FEMA and a local government agency to sit down and try to work through a dispute maybe in the maps. So there's 5 individuals that are appointed to that. They're experts in hydrology or hydraulics or engineering that can we can give them that information, and they're an independent eye that can take a look at some of those things. That's likely where we would end up if we go down the appeal route. So what's left to appeal? 18 months ago we sent over 70 comments into FEMA. And they primarily focused on the hydraulics of the basin, so how the water flows through the basin. And for the most part, all those comments were incorporated into the map. So when I said we have a better product based on those comments, that's true. They took into account the questions and concerns that we had raised. However, one of the portions that FEMA did not take into account was our comments on the hydrology or how much water is coming through the basin. That's important because the different modeling amounts, whether it's 10,000 CFS, which is FEMA's number for the 100-year discharge, or what we think could be the number, that 6,500 to 8,000 CFS that Ackerman Asphalt helped us model. There's quite a bit of difference there, and that could be substantial in the top of the water during that 100-year floodplain or the base flood elevation. Whether that's 3 feet on a house or 1 foot on a house, when you're trying to evaluate the flood insurance impact could be substantial. So if we do go down the appeal route, that's likely the area that we would focus on, because we think there could be a case to be made there regarding the hydrology in the basin. Kind of a quick run through of where we're at. We don't have any kind of decisions on tonight's agenda. It was more of an informational topic, just to kind of walk you through where we're at and then what would be the process going forward. We kind of have 2 paths here that we can go down. So, Mr. Mayor, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Lance. Alderman Straight, I saw your ears perk up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess, Lance, as I hear you discuss the costs associated with an appeal, I'd be curious to hear, if we don't and we implement this 6 months earlier, let's say, what's that cost going to be on the residents of Minot with flood insurance rates? I think it'd be important to maybe take a look at that comparison. And from my standpoint, as somebody who has flood insurance and delay. I understand that it's taxpayer dollars one way or another. They're paying it personally or we're paying it. But I would be curious to know that number, Lance, when we make that determination.
Mr. Mayor, in Alderman Straight, it's not a very straightforward number to get to, and because there's a lot of assumptions that have to be made. Do we make the assumption that everyone on day one would be at the actuarial rate? Do we make the assumption that half or the majority or some combination would take advantage of the grandfathering and then be stepped up to that rate over time? Then, of course, long term, we need to think about is how long will it take us to implement our flood control project. So, if it's a few years or if it's a few decades, of course, that hits the bottom line and what we will realize from a city standpoint, what the residents will realize. So it would take some work to try to get to that. We can see what we can do to ballpark it, but I think it'd be a pretty high number, to be honest.
Lance, regarding kind of the risk-reward aspect of this, I think preliminary discussions that we had as we had kind of seen these maps come out, FEMA would have the option of literally just turning around and rejecting the appeal immediately. Am I correct on that one, or do they have a period of time that they have to go through on the consideration on this?
Mr. Mayor, they do have a period of time that they have to work through. If we submit an appeal, basically it's a couple options happen. They could say, well, yeah, city, you're right, and the maps become effective immediately. They could say, well, we disagree with your submittal, so therefore we'd probably want to go to the scientific review panel if we wanted to continue down that track. Or the third option would be that they might request more information. Maybe there's an incomplete submittal, or they say, well, okay, I see where you're going with this, but we need more information. So there might be an opportunity to provide more to them. So at this point, it could take any one of those tracks. Until that we start going down that path, it's hard to give you an exact amount of time.
Alderman Straight.
Mr. Mayor, I guess I'm just wondering, it's a basin-wide project, strength in numbers in terms of our appeal. I would question, and I shouldn't put it past the government, but if the whole entire basin submits the appeal together, I would feel that it would be very less likely that the government would just turn right around and throw it back in our face. But I don't know. I just my own thinking out loud.
Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, thanks. Lance, I appreciate the update. I know it's hard to give. I can appreciate the challenges of trying to make the assumptions. Do we have examples of, and we know that FEMA disagrees with some aspects of our technical assessment, right? Because they didn't incorporate it into the current versions. So we know, it seems plausible to me that if we appeal, we're headed towards the scientific Review Committee. Has anybody else been down that path recently? Are there other communities that we can sort of look to see how long that process took them? And because I think at the end of the day, the time is probably the most significant factor in all of this. I mean, if we're looking at another 12 to 18 months, if that's how long that process takes, the investment to appeal starts to make sense to me. So I don't know what we can do to gather more of that information, or if we just have to roll the dice. I think as we contemplate this decision over the very near term, whatever you guys can come up with to provide context on informing that decision would be greatly appreciated.
Mr. Mayor and Alderman Wolski, and we'll work towards that. I know that when we met with the state and FEMA some time ago now, and we talked about, what are the paths to an appeal or what that might look like. I believe at that time we would have been the first or one of the first to go through the scientific review panel. So this is kind of a newer appeal technique. Mr. Ackerman and his team have looked at this and tried to come up with somewhat of a mapping of time, and we think that if we would follow this through, probably the fastest that it would start to finish would be somewhere around that 200 some days. Now, depending on how that review goes, it could be much longer. It could come out that there's a result that has FEMA redo the hydrology, which then they had to redo the hydraulics, and then now it's a couple years delay. So
Sure.
There is truly risk either way.
Yep.
It's somewhat hard to quantify, unfortunately.
Lance, when did our clock start ticking on the 90 days?
It hasn't started yet, Mr. Mayor. They'll give us about a 2-week heads up, is my understanding, before this hits the Federal Register. It hasn't happened yet, so I would say we have at least 2 weeks. But again, it's kind of like, from what I understand, is you get in line and then eventually you're in the queue, I guess. So
Perhaps when impeachment wraps up. Alderman Wolski.
We have 90 days to turn in the appeal once they start the clock ticking.
That's correct.
That's correct. Okay.
Further questions for our city engineer?
Mr. Mayor,
Alderman Wolski.
I might just briefly revisit an issue that Alderman Straight brought up with the Lowhead Dam over by the water treatment plant. Lance, just a recap on the capital improvement plan. I think in one of our emails you suggested that maybe that project has been programmed 2024?
Sounds right.
Okay. Just providing information there. Thank you.
Further questions? Thank you, Lance.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. 9.4 is under receiving public testimony. This one was brought forward after a couple of different conversations over the last couple of weeks with at least one individual that also fits into another category that we have already discussed concerning safety with at City Hall. However, just bringing this forward for informational purposes only, and perhaps a little bit of discussion from council, I want to just direct your attention towards section 2-31A5 on our ordinances. And this was emailed out, and I'm trying to think if this was sent to Alderman Pittner and myself after that meeting, regarding debate limitations. No member of the city council shall speak more than twice at the same meeting on any question except by leave of the presiding officer. No speaker shall address the city council for a period longer than 5 minutes without permission given by the presiding officer. Otherwise, it shall be the duty of the presiding officer to call the speaker to order upon the expiration of that time limit. This rule may be suspended at any time by a majority vote of the city council. Alderman Straight had kind of referenced earlier giving extra time to at least one individual in the past. After our conversation, Alderman Pittner, myself, the city manager, our police chief, and now current police chief, became aware that that individual may come and after some lengthy and very limiting ability to, I think, find a reason with the individual, it became, I think, more apparent that very well on this issue could open up the door to a very lengthy, profane, grandstand, filibuster, monopolize, however you want to quantify. But going through kind of that process, especially after a couple of the individuals, and then moving public comment towards the end of the meeting so that we could address the issues that we had prepared for, very deeply considering sticking more closely to that 5-minute mark for individuals, of course, given circumstances beyond, I think, just ordinary, being able to allow further time as stated in the ordinance. But looking to the council with any objections as moving forward with our meetings with that purpose of sticking closer to that allotted time for that purpose. Of course, as stated within the ordinance itself, that can be changed. Alderman Wolski.
Mr. Mayor, in terms of personal appearances and comments that aren't on our agenda, I am more than comfortable with a 5-minute time limit and you exercising discretion in those circumstances as to how to best achieve that. As far as the council debates and our 5-minute time limits, I think once again, discretion, right? If there's worthy discussion, then and I trust your ability to manage those circumstances. But in terms of personal appearances, I think 5 minutes is more than enough time.
Alderman Pittner.
Thank you, Mayor. And yes, I just wanted to second your thoughts on a lot of that and a lot of the conversations we've had with maybe some colorful individuals as far as the topic of conversation and how out of hand maybe some of them have gotten. I don't think it's fair to ourselves sitting up here or the public to maybe put ourselves at risk with some of the situations in this setting. So I think that I'd like to even see maybe potentially a timer put up just for the transparency of everyone attending or watching online to see kind of how that process is unfolding, or even if an individual sitting up there to be very to the point and on task with what they're talking about to not get sidetracked. I think it would be maybe a worthy investment of this council, as how small it might be, but just to give some, let whoever is speaking up there kind of know where their time stands and not have to be cut off in the middle of their thoughts. So just wanted to second the thoughts.
Alderman Olson.
Mr. Mayor, I think that most of the time when people do come to speak to us, they're not speaking off the cuff. They typically have something that they want to get across to us. And just with this reminder, it'll help them prepare their comments, knowing that they have, basically a 5-minute time frame. So I think it'll be helpful, and I think most people will be understanding of it.
Mm-hmm. Alderman Johnser.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I tend to concur with what's been said in the sense that I think some flexibility and some discretion on the part of the presiding officer, typically yourself, is appropriate. And I think it's also I think it's also important, as Alderman Straight said earlier, that we be receptive to hearing from our citizens who want to convey a message. That said, I think it's certainly fair to ask them to do their best to communicate that message as succinctly and as straightforwardly as they can so that we can deal with the matter at hand. And I think certainly there have been some exceptions where it got out of hand, or the comments got out of hand. But I think that's the exception, and so I think for the most part it's been working fairly well.
Mm-hmm. And by and large, I don't think we've had this issue run into too many times in the last couple of years, but in the, I guess, era of preference or preventing seeking the issue of favoritism on behalf of some. That is more so why this was being brought forward with respect to Alderman Pittner's and my discussion with the individual, and then just kind of the overview. So if it might not be too much difficulty just to have staff put a very low-level estimate of something like that might be indicative. It doesn't have to be a big stopwatch or anything, but I don't know if we can take a look at what some what other
Mr. Mayor.
councils may have out there for inclusions. Alderman Wolski.
I would just share that in various circumstances where I've had to speak on a time limit, or I've had to sort of help somebody through a situation where they were speaking on a time limit, I set the timer on my cell phone and I kind of throw a signal when we get to that particular point. I don't know if, maybe there's a very informal way to address this in the future is all I'm suggesting.
Alderman Pittner.
Thank you, Mayor. Just wanted to bring it to the attention. We did make an investment with some electronics sitting behind you. Maybe it would be receptive to have a timer.
Green light.
Or a stopwatch of some sort, maybe put behind you or on the screens provided to everyone in
Very true.
attendance. And I don't know if that's my second time speaking. I think I'm done now.
City Manager Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple of quick points. I have used the system you're talking about. It's actually pretty inexpensive and quite easy to use. It's a red, yellow, green light. It gets set by the presiding officer, and it does its thing. It's automatically programmed. When you end up with about 30 seconds or 45 seconds from the end of your time, it flashes, yellow, and then when it turns red, you're out of time. I guess my caution, we can look into that and get a cost estimate for you if that's what you'd like to use. My caution to you would be this. Don't buy it and then start giving everybody deference, because if you do that, you'll run into the same problem of, having to deal with this issue. Why did this person get an extra time? Why did that person get extra time? So if you aren't intending to adhere to those timeframes consistently, you may find your liability become worsened and be more difficult to choose whether or not a person gets time and whether another person does not. So you'd want to think that through before you implemented a system, I think, just out of consistency.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor.
Alderman Patagula, and then we'll come back to you.
I would generally echo the comments of the other people, particularly Mark. I would also point out to the public that they're certainly welcome to prepare written remarks, handouts. We've had people show videos. So although the speaking, might be limited to around 5 minutes, they certainly have more opportunity to present things to us and to those viewing and watching. And I think that would be a very nice way to give people the ample opportunity to make their point, but yet try to be somewhat efficient in terms of the group's time and everyone's time.
Alderman Wolski.
Not attached to this item, but
Okay.
I do have another item.
Okay. Alderman Straight.
Mr. Mayor, I just wanted to commend city staff, and in these instances that have been discussed, I am incredibly impressed with our staff that has gone out of their way to address the resident concerns, and so I think if it's that individual's opportunity just to voice their frustration back to us, I think to Mr. Barry's point, it's really on you, Mr. Mayor, just consistency, and I think we defer to you and roll with your lead on it, sir.
We can certainly explore this a little more down the road as well, too. Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, thank you. Council, we had a item on our January 21st agenda. It was a retail beer and wine license for Prairie Sky Breads LLC, doing business as Prairie Sky Breads. It was ultimately pulled from that meeting because they had not yet secured their certificate of occupancy. That final inspection took place this afternoon at noon. I heard from Ms. Metalka that we do have the final sign-offs from our appropriate departments. That would be the fire marshal and the building official, I believe. So given that we have the appropriate information available from our staff, I would move that, and time being of the essence, this is a business that's looking to get open, and they still have work to do before they can secure a state license. So I would move that we approve the retail beer and wine license for Prairie Sky Breads and get them on their way.
Second.
Motion by Alderman Wolski for the approval as mentioned, second by Alderman Straight. Discussion. We could just verification as well, we were handed out, but our city clerk, confirmation of the requirements that were before us that were holding it up, have they all been met?
Yes, Mayor Sitma and Alderman Wolski, they have met all of the requirements, and the police chief, building official, and fire marshal have done their inspections and signed off on them.
Thank you. Discussion on the motion. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Straight.
Yes.
Motion approved. We have no remaining items under our miscellaneous discussion items. That takes us to number 10, adjournment.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion by Alderman Pittner to adjourn, second by Alderman Janser. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, same sign. We're adjourned.